Hello, everybody. Sorry to be a few minutes late. That had nothing to do with the U.S. Solutions Summit. It was just me having a little bit of a problem with my machine. That's all. Not much of a technical problem, though. Howdy, Lana. How are you? And hi, Dolores. How are you doing? Nice to see you. I want to begin tonight with a review of the first of the U.S. Solutions Summits from Carr TD Media. So, the Solutions Summit today ran from 4 p.m. Eastern Time to roughly 9 p.m. Eastern Time. It ended pretty much on time. There were 6 panels. Unfortunately, right at the start, there were technical difficulties. And these lasted for the first the 2 panels. The panel 1 was about third-party candidates and getting money out of politics. And it featured Kerry Barber, Nathan Klein, and Aidan Hill, who appeared to have very interesting views on third-party candidates. They talk more about third-party candidates than actually getting money out of politics. They talked a lot about the problems that were caused by money in politics. But it was hard to pick up the thread because the technical difficulties in sound and in restreaming were really stopping it. So you weren't able to focus in on the panel. That's unfortunate because it looked like they were going to be very interesting panels. The moderator of the first panel was Joe Evans, a kind of interesting guy. He's a libertarian, but in some ways a left-leaning libertarian, and in some ways a right-leaning libertarian. I think he would have brought a very interesting perspective to the moderation. Maybe he did, but it was hard to pick up the thread there. There were further technical problems with the second panel. How do we fix education? And that included actually Madeline Hoffman, who had been the Green Party vice presidential candidate, and as well a professor at a community college for more than about 20 years now, somebody who knows a lot about practical politics from a Green Party perspective, and who knows a lot about education too. And then there's Jeff Carr, who was a former education commissioner from New Mexico. Very bright guy and very nice guy. And it was very hard to pick up on what they had to say. And Steph Zamorano wasn't able to tolerate the technical problems, and so she left the party. It was too hard for her to just cope with the interruptions that were constantly going on. there were sound echoes that were very serious. And so basically her panel, okay, was blown, okay, as well. I think what happened to the first two panels also cut down on the attendance, okay, because of course a lot of people were anxious to start, and they were there at the start, and it took quite some time until the technical difficulties were solved. But solved they were in time for the third panel. That was a panel that was moderated by Andy Kennedy. And I thought that he did a good job, okay, of moderating the panel. He allowed a discussion to go on, and he picked up a lot on the difficulties of running for Congress. There were two topics in this panel. There was the running for Congress topic, and there was the topic of getting money out of politics. Now, the first panel was supposed to focus on getting money out of politics too, but they decided beforehand, the moderator of the first panel, Joe Evans, decided beforehand that he was going to focus on the problems involved in money in politics, the problems being caused by the money in politics, and he was going to let panel 3 focus on the solutions. However, the way panel 3 developed, there was a lot of desire on the part of the panelists to talk about the problems they encountered in running for Congress. Okay, quite a lot of those problems were actually caused by the discrepancies, okay, in running. But it was interesting to hear from the candidates anyway. Dan Whitfield, who had tried to run in 2020, but who wasn't able to get actually to get as far as the ballot. He wasn't able to get on the ballot. He raised a decent amount of money for the campaign for someone just starting out. I think he said something like $75,000, which for someone starting out, okay, as young as he is, who wasn't even on the primary ballot, I thought he must have done a very good grassroots job there. But it was very difficult. He talked, okay, of the legal difficulties and the intervention, okay, of Republican Party politicians in trying to stop him from getting on the ballot, even getting interference from Bill Barr, evidently. That was an interesting story, certainly, to hear about. Carr, of course, did a very good job of talking about his problems in San Francisco in running against the madam herself, Nancy Pelosi, of course, in the California 12th. And his remarks were extremely interesting. Brent Welder also had some very interesting remarks about his attempt to run for Congress in the Kansas City 3rd. He also mentioned that he probably won't be running in 2022 because his wife is intending to run for Attorney General, okay, of Kansas, and that he was going to support her by basically helping her as much as he could with her campaign. And it was interesting to note that she was going to be running against Chris Kobach in Kansas. So that should be a contest that would be quite interesting. Andy Kennedy, okay, is the moderator, did ask some questions about how the candidates might be fighting the disadvantages of money, okay, in politics. And they talked basically there about, building mass movement and, participatory politics. But only one question was asked, okay, of Dan Whitfield, concerning what he might do if he won in order to get money out of politics. And I don't think he's thought really too much about that, so he didn't have an answer. Unfortunately, there wasn't time to put the same question to Brent Welder and to Shahed Buttar, who might have had some more thoughtful answers on that final question. All in all, though, this was a very interesting panel, and I thought that Andy Kennedy did a good job, okay, as the moderator. I was pleased with the panel and very, very ecstatic that the technical problems had been solved and that third panel went off without a hitch. There was music during the intermissions. Each panel had about 5, 6, or 7 minute intermission. Okay, and there was music from, I think her name was Lily Rose or Lily Keys. I wasn't really clear on what her name was. I think she was using a handle for part of the time and her name, okay, for another part of the time. But it still was entertaining to have the music, and it was really a good thing to see that while they were trying to shift from panel to panel. The fourth panel had 2 people on it who had been presidential candidates. One was Mark Charles, who had run as an independent in 2020 as a First Nations candidate. And he did not start, okay, at the beginning, okay, of the panel. He came on later. So the first part of the panel, which was one actually run by Shane Coughlin, who's the head of KRTD Media, and who is one of the people most responsible for the summit, pulling everything together and generally doing a very, very good job with it. And I think, given that this was the first one, that Shane Coughlin, okay, and Indy left, and all the people who helped them are to be congratulated, because all in all, they really did a very good job on the panel. But I thought Howie Hawkins was very good in his discussion, and Christina Tobin, who's the founder of the Free, and Equal Elections Foundation, who was doing her best to try to influence our elections in the way of making a place for third parties. In other words, running debates for third-party candidates, working on new ways of voting, okay, in primaries. I thought that she spoke really very impressively about her efforts, and I was pleased also with Howie's knowledge about the difficulties of running as a third-party candidate and the importance of going to rank choice voting and presenting it as an effort to find a solution that we might be able to actually accomplish. When Mark Charles talked about the problem of the U.S. keeping its treaties with the First Nations and how the law was treating this. Okay, in other words, the law was basically taking the position that Congress could break the treaties, but then if Congress withdraws from the treaties, which of course Congress can do with respect to treaties, there's nothing being done by the Congress in terms of upholding the rights of the First Nations to get back the lands that they were entitled to before the treaties were signed. So this seemed like a very unequal thing going on in our court system. And unfortunately, I didn't think that the panelists were very clear about what kinds of solutions might be available to redress the situation there. It could be if the court system were to make clear to Congress that if they pulled out of the treaties, there would have to be reparations to the First Nations. If the courts were to come to such a decision and make it clear to Congress that the only way it could withdraw from the treaties was on pain of restoring the properties of the First Nations that were exchanged treaties, Congress might not be so quick to withdraw from the treaties when it suits them. But in any case, the solutions that came out of that particular panel, I don't think were very clear, but there were still some very good ideas that came out of the panel. So all in all, I was very pleased with the panel and with the panelists. I thought Mark Charles was very impressive. And Howie Hawkins impressed me more than he ever had before, actually. I suppose I don't think I've been watching Howie Hawkins enough. I thought also Christina Tobin did a very good job on her end as well. And Shane Coughlin did a good job also as the moderator, of the panel. Next came panel 5, which was kind of a blockbuster panel because it was about the questions of should we do direct action or electoral politics. And the second topic was election security. The election security topic. The panelists were Bruno Franco from Frank Analysis, and Hardlands Media's Kit by Cabello and Dan Lepker. And then there was Pasta Jardula from the Convo Couch, who appeared in this panel as well. This was certainly one of the most, if not the most exciting panel. I thought the 6th panel was very good too, and I'll get to that in a little while. But I thought, Bruno Franco was very effective in his emphasizing the need for the progressive movement to focus less on problems and more on solutions to the problems. And he was also very effective in making points of criticism of what the independent left is doing in terms of, its media ideas, and its media streams. And I thought his criticisms were largely justified, in that respect. And they basically come down to there's too much emphasis on the problems and criticizing the mainstream media, and focusing on that. And that might feel good, and it might be good for the start, but it doesn't leave people in a good place. And I think that he certainly was right about that and made a good contribution to the panel in emphasizing that and emphasizing solutions so heavily. I thought that but Kit made but some very good comments about how hard it is to bring people along into activism. And he talked about the important work that Hard Lens Media was doing in giving not only a media face to its efforts, but an activism face, as well, an activism side. And he talked about how important that was. But Dan Lepker's primary message, though, I thought was one of the most important, of the day. That message was that we need to build an infrastructure and we need to build movements that go along with our media that are capable of placing continuous day-to-day pressure on our decision makers when it comes to issues. He pointed out what it costs, how expensive it is for lobbying organizations to put into the field people who will work 5 days a week or 6 days a week in keeping in contact with the Congress, and with candidates and with people, in office, so that we have continuous pressure on them, so that they are really afraid of us. And Kit Cabello reinforced him, in this point, that it's very important that we be able to put this absolutely continuous pressure on them. Now, of course, that's a solution in general, but it's not a solution specifically. And the Hard Lens Media people didn't really have specific suggestions about how to put together that kind of infrastructure. But they were quite right, I think, in saying that, it is needed. I don't want to talk about this now, but for years I was involved, in an effort to develop a new social media platform that would focus on building voting blocks, and electoral coalitions that would put constant day-to-day pressure based on issues on our candidates, that the voting blocks would be organized around issues and the electoral coalitions, as well, and that they would develop infrastructures through the social media platform to place this day-to-day pressure right on the decision makers, and never able to raise money for our efforts, because, of course, if you're going to start a social media platform that is as sophisticated as what we had in mind, you need millions and millions of dollars to be invested up front in order to start that. And we were never able to make that happen. But I thought it was interesting that the Hard Lens Media people saw the need, to do that, and that the people I was working with and myself had a solution to that particular problem, but were not able to implement it for want of funds. Now, I thought Pastor Jardula did a tremendous job in that panel in relation to pointing out to us all how important it is to be able to ensure that our elections can be trusted, and in emphasizing how important it is to work hard through pressure and legal actions to get data on each and every one of the elections that go on in this country so we can actually have access to what happened and to auditing the elections and to getting recounts of the votes when we need recounts, real recounts, not sampling, audited recounts, and how decisions had to be made as to whether it would go entirely with paper ballots or with electronic systems that were open source and non-hackable as well, secure, completely secure. And Pasta spoke very forcefully, and eloquently, about that. And I thought that he was very effective on that. I thought Andy Kennedy was great in moving the discussion from one to another of the participants, holding things within time limits, and bringing out the very important points that they were making. So for me, I thought this was probably the best of the panels, but not by that big a margin, because I also thought that panel 6 was a very, very effective panel too. There was a little surprise in panel 6 because that was supposed to have Jimmy Dore, who was there. He was there. And Justin Jackson, he was there too. And Fiorella, Isabel was there. Graham Elwood, and Ron Placone. They were all there. So the panel had these great people on it. But it had surprise moderators. The Vanguardians, Gavin and Zach, were brought in order to moderate the panel as a kind of surprise. And I thought that they did one hell of a job of moderating this panel and moving the discussion along from person to person. I thought, that Jimmy Dore, he was very good in his parts and in bringing some sardonic humor to the panel. I thought that Justin Jackson was very good in putting forth his own ideas about what could be done about the problem, which is media ownership by the megacorps, the importance of the media in allowing the mainstream in politics to control things. In other words, the central position of the media, and allowing them to do that, and allowing them to basically mold opinion in the country because of their alliance with the political parties, the mainstream parties. But a lot of time was spent in talking about censorship by the main platforms, by Facebook, and by YouTube, and how hard it was now for people who had built large followings to actually be economically sustainable on these platforms because they were getting demonetized. Fiorella, Graham Elwood, also Ron Placone, Jimmy Dore, they all spoke very, very effectively on this. And they've thought a lot about how to get around it and their general strategy of getting around it, which makes sense to me. okay, is that what they basically will do is continue to use the main platforms basically as advertising vehicles, still make themselves available on the major platforms, but prepare more and more to shift over to the Rockfin platform, and then there's a new platform. What's it called? Panbake. Because exactly, that's not an operational platform, but it evidently will be one. Okay, in roughly a month, and it will be a decentralized platform based on blockchain technology, and it will be a secure platform. And since it will be decentralized, it won't be possible for the platform to demonetize people. Turns out that even Patreon is starting to try to censor people now. It's it's really that bad. So I thought the discussion in this panel from all the panelists was very, very effective. I thought that Fiorella did a terrific job in her analysis of the problems, and I thought that the Vanguardians did a great job, of moderating the panel with so many strong personalities on it. It is not so easy, and so I thought this was a very good panel, and that the panelists had their fingers on solutions to the problem. Don't think the solutions will be easy to implement. I think times are going to be hard for a while, but I think eventually the new platforms will catch on, that it's likely that all of us are going to move over to the newer platforms, and that basically YouTube and Facebook will be left behind in not too long a time. So what I want to say is that all in all, I think that this first Solutions Summit was a substantial success. I think it would have been a great success, except for the technical difficulties on the first two panels. But I think that KRTD Media is certainly to be congratulated on this the first effort, and I hope they follow up with other efforts like this, perhaps even weekly, or bi-weekly efforts with smaller installments of the summit, and then to go ahead with their plan for quarterly summits, which would be major efforts like this one was. But they really have to stay warm on the technical problems, and they have to stay warm in giving people, an outlet. And if they continue as they've started off here and improve as I expect them to improve, I think they will have added a tremendous amount to the independent left. So that, is my review of this. I'm now going to shift over to the other main topic. I want to shift for just a second. The other main topic is Latin American foreign policy. So, and of course, I want to show, my Patreon.com address. Of course. Because I really need some Patreon activity, folks. So anyway, here we are. And I'm going to start to share our Latin American topics as we go forward. You may have heard of some of these news items. I've picked them up over the last month or so. This is from Counterpunch, entitled, the U.S. role behind the defeat of Ecuador's leftist presidential candidate. This is by Roger Harris. And so there's a picture, of Andres Arauz, who was defeated in the presidential contest in Ecuador, on April 11th. And the article points out the U.S. role in the defeat, of Andres Arauz in Ecuador's presidential contest on April 11th was not overt because it did not need to be. According to a high-ranking Latin American diplomat, we met with the diplomat and others on an official election observation delegation with code pink. Names of some sources remain anonymous due to a hostile political environment towards the progressives. This was a setback for the citizens' revolution movement founded by Rafael Correa, and it will have profound implications for Ecuador and beyond, fortifying the U.S. allied reactionary bloc in Latin America. When Correa left office, he did so with a 60% approval rating. He'd been twice elected president on the first round. That was unprecedented, in Ecuador, which had had a turnover of 7 presidents in the previous 10 years. His party had won 14 elections, reflecting the popularity of their the redistribution of wealth programs, including reducing extreme poverty in half. Anyway, Lenin Moreno, who's going to leave the presidency on May 24th, that's 2 days from now, with a single-digit approval rating, was the successor to Correa. And he unexpectedly went far right because he was supposed to be a Correa follower. But anyway, much happened in the ensuing 4 years. Correa went from being the most popular democratically elected president in the country's history to having his party rejected by an electoral majority. And so what happened, is the question asked. Moreno turned sharply right and employed lawfare to decapitate the leadership of the party. His own vice president, Jorge Glass, is now in prison, and other top officials have been forced to flee the country. But Correa, who was accused of using psychic influence, was convicted in absentia in an evidence-weak corruption trial that prevented him from coming back to Ecuador. According to his attorney, Fausto Jarin, the president, specifically Moreno, was assisted by the U.S. in his legal dismantling of his own party. Casting pretenses aside, he was in Washington on the day of the first round of the Ecuadorian presidential elections. Just before the second round, he and his top officials flew to the Galapagos to meet with the U.S. ambassador. Why they had to fly to the Galapagos to do that, I don't know. But anyway, he handed the shop over to the U.S. He revoked Julian Assange's Ecuadorian citizenship, allowing Assange to be arrested in the UK. He recognized Juan Guaido's bogus claim to the presidency of Venezuela. After Vice President Pence went to Ecuador to visit, the FBI was welcomed back. Even a U.S. military base in the Galapagos that was part of Ecuador, it's part of Ecuador, the Galapagos, was gifted to Washington. He expelled the Cuban doctors and withdrew from key regional alliances like the UNICER Alliance, CELAC, and ALBA. At a time of COVID, these actions had lethal consequences. Had Ecuador instead maintained its membership in the regional organizations, their collective power could have been used to obtain vaccines and other resources to fight the pandemic. And in fact, just having the Cuban doctors there and employing the Cuban system of containing the virus might have saved a lot of lives, in Ecuador. A lot of people have died, in Ecuador. In deaths per million, it has a far worse record than Venezuela has. Venezuela, of course, maintained its ties with Cuba and had its Cuban doctors there helping them to run the system. Anyway, Moreno imposed an IMF austerity package on Ecuador, which was partly withdrawn in the face of a mass indigenous-led protest in October of 2019. Then, under the cover of the presidential campaign in the pandemic, the president reinstated the unpopular measures. And Moreno, the turncoat, adopted a full-throated neoliberal program and is scrambling to enact some additional economic reforms before his term is over to prevent the next administration from, quote, putting the toothpaste back in the tube, quote unquote. But he needn't worry because incoming President Guillermo Lasso not only shares the same neoliberal program, but members of Lasso's right-wing political party collaborated with Mr. Moreno in the National Assembly. This has been a brilliant strategy for the right by putting in place a full neoliberal program. Before he leaves office, the president is sparing Lasso the onus of the unpopular measures while serving international finance, which is represented by Lasso and by the U.S. So the rest of the article is about how lawfare was used to rig the electoral playing field, and it's interesting to read about it, but basically it's a story of the manipulations of the United States and the right wing, in Ecuador. So that was one instance in which the U.S. was successful in reinstalling the neoliberal imperialist regime in a country that had moved far away from it. The article also says ruling elites hold elections, to legitimize their rule, not because they believe in democracy, but by the time of the 2021 presidential election in Ecuador, the playing field had been rendered so precipitously unlevel that the U.S. had little need to overtly intervene as it did in Bolivia in 2019. But that did not mean the U.S. was not actively intervening. The websites of USAID, of NED, of NDI, and IRI make no secret of the imperial hubris of pretending to, quote, promote democracy, unquote, in Ecuador. The U.S. laid the groundwork, according to a high-level diplomat, to unify the right and rig the contest against the left. As William Blum said, the U.S. intelligence had prior to Correa and likely since, quote, infiltrated almost often at the highest levels, almost all political organizations of significance from the far left to the far right. In virtually every department of the Ecuadorian government could be found men occupying positions high and low who collaborated with the CIA for money, unquote. Commenting on the new Biden administration, Correa's former ambassador, specifically Ricardo Coango observed that U.S. foreign policy is the same with Democrats and Republicans. The Democrats, he added, are more dangerous because they are better at speaking about cooperation when in fact they are intervening. And Roger Harris is on the board of the Task Force on the Americas, a 32-year-old anti-imperialist human rights organization. I thought that article was quite a revealing one, even though it came nearly a month old. And next, another Counterpunch article. When it comes to imperialism, Counterpunch is a very good source. And this is by Roger Harris, too, on May 4th. Government report documents U.S. responsibility for Venezuela's by humanitarian dilemma. So this is about our foreign policy in Venezuela, which you know something about already. Venezuela was once one of the most prosperous countries in Latin America. The popular classes enjoyed major advances from the Bolivarian revolution that was initiated by Hugo Chavez. And today Venezuela is experiencing an unprecedented economic crisis with severe humanitarian consequences. We, of course, blame the crisis on the mismanagement and corruption of their government that is headed by Nicolas Maduro, and the Venezuelan government, in its turn, faults of the U.S. and its allies for imposing sanctions, which are unilateral coercive measures, illegal under international law. In other words, we're violating international law right and left, imposing collective punishments on various countries for the sake of an imperialist foreign policy. An official U.S. Congressional Research Service report issued on April 28th called Venezuela Background and U.S. Relations suggests the Venezuelan government has valid arguments that it's being strangulated by U.S. sanctions. According to the report, it asserts that, quote, sanctions, particularly on the state oil company in 2019, likely contributed to the steeper decline of the Venezuelan economy. The Maduro government has defaulted on all its bonds, and U.S. sanctions prohibit debt restructuring with creditors. So we're blocking debt restructuring so they can get back on track. The CRS report provides a brief revision of history to fit an imperialist narrative to justify the hybrid war to achieve regime change in Venezuela. Hence the U.S.-backed coup in 2002, when the U.S. government welcomed a return to democracy, which was euphemistically referred to as President Chavez, quote, brief ouster from power, unquote. The subsequent employers' lockout in 2002 and 2003, designed to economically cripple the government and cause its fall, is called an, quote, oil workers' strike, unquote. Okay, the lethally violent garimbas calculated to overthrow the elected Maduro government are called, quote, student-led, unquote, protests. While in all the above instances, the U.S. role in events is rendered invisible, the report describes how, quote, Congress has provided funding to support democratic civil society in Venezuela, unquote, like fun, right? Which is Washington's duplicitous shorthand for regime change programs. The report continues, quote, for almost 2 decades, the U.S. has provided democracy-related assistance to Venezuelan civil society through the U.S. Agency for International Development and the National Endowment A for democracy, in other words, AID and NED. The former through its appropriately named Office of Transition Initiatives. For fiscal year 2021, the administration requested $200 million to support transition in Venezuela, unquote. In January 2019, the U.S. and its allies ceased to recognize Maduro as Venezuela's legitimate president after then National Assembly leader Juan Guaido, who would never run for national office, quote, announced he was willing to serve as interim president, unquote. Guaido's coup attempts are euphemistically described as, quote, high-profile but ultimately unsuccessful efforts to encourage security forces to abandon Maduro, unquote. Even the U.S. allies that have recognized Guaido, quote, oppose military intervention in Venezuela and have expressed concerns about the humanitarian effects of broad sanctions, unquote. According to the report laments that, quote, the Venezuelan government has made it difficult for Venezuelans to obtain a valid passport and therefore legal status outside the country, unquote. The difficulty conveniently omitted from the report is that when a foreign state expels legitimate Maduro representatives and installs Guaido's, Caracas has no means of conducting normal embassy activities. Key in the U.S. hybrid war to achieve regime change in Venezuela are the economic sanctions the report forthrightly describes. Quote, in the multi-year economic crisis, one of the worst economic crises in the world since World War II, its economy has contracted by more than 75% since 2014, estimated as the single largest economic collapse outside of war in at least 45 years, and more than twice the magnitude of the Great Depression in the United States. Imports, which Venezuela relies on for most consumer goods, have fallen by almost 95% since 2013. The country faces shortages of critical food and medicine, unquote. Contrary to the U.S. official narrative that Venezuela's revolution is root cause of all problems, the report admits, quote, the trigger for Venezuela's economic crisis was the crash in world oil prices in 2014. The report explains how U.S. sanctions confounded the Venezuelan government's attempts to address this crisis. Piecemeal efforts to address the crisis, including price controls and the creation of a new digital currency, the Petro, were ineffective because they were blocked by the U.S. government. Some initiatives, such as restructuring debt or bringing the government budget into balance, I'm quoting now, were pledged and then abandoned, again prevented by the U.S. government sanctions. Subsequent rounds of U.S. sanctions targeting the government, central bank, and gold sectors, as well as limiting Venezuela's access to the U.S. financial system, likely exacerbated economic pressures in Venezuela. With private creditors unwilling and unable due to sanctions to purchase new Venezuelan debt, but the Maduro government routinely turned to its main international financial backers, China, Russia, and more recently Iran. But China and Russia are increasingly reluctant to extend further assistance due to secondary sanctions. In other words, because they help, then they get exposed to sanctions too. The sanctions are not just against Venezuela, but affect other countries so that the sanctions amount to a blockade. The sanctions framework also prohibits non-U.S. entities from transaction with PDVSA, the Venezuelan state-owned oil company, in U.S. dollars, and made non-U.S. entities subject to having their U.S. property blocked should it be determined that they materially assisted by PDVSA. under the sanctions framework. Treasury also has sanctioned numerous individuals, vessels, and companies involved in trading and shipping Venezuelan oil. This progressive application of sanctions, designed to prevent export and sale of oil produced in Venezuela, has made it more difficult, though not impossible, for PDVSA to complete petroleum sales and export transactions. So Venezuela's dilemma is patria o muerte, which means country or death, homeland or death, sorry. The U.S. government imposes the choice on Venezuela in the words of the Latin American revolutionary slogan of patria o muerte, homeland or death. In the period 2017-2018 alone, some 40,000 deaths in Venezuela were attributed to the sanctions. So don't tell me we're not having a war with Venezuela. I mean, a war that took 40,000 Venezuelans. They only have 27 million people there. In the period of 2 years, that's quite a number of deaths for a war for a relatively small country. That was pre-COVID and before the most devastating sanctions took effect. So who knows how many deaths now are attributed to sanctions. Perhaps it's up to 100 or 150,000 now. In the weaponization of the pandemic, the U.S. took advantage of the health vulnerability to make conditions even worse, according to the report. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic further exacerbated the economic challenges facing the Venezuelan government. Fuel shortages, exacerbated by the end of the U.S. licensed oil for diesel swaps in the fall of 2020, reportedly have made food distribution and humanitarian aid by delivery more challenging, noting that it is, quote, unclear how Venezuela's economy can rebuild in the absence of a significant reorientation of economic policies, unquote. The report calls for the abandonment of the Bolivarian social project and adoption of an IMF structural adjustment program. Oh. That means austerity in Venezuela forever, by the way, which would remove price controls on vital necessities, privatize banks, and fully open the economy to the dictates of international finance. Imperialism, direct imperialism, right? Quote, the economic crisis, now exacerbated by the pandemic, unquote, the report coldly explains, quote, has been devastating for its citizens with no clear or quick resolution on the horizon. In the absence of a resolution to the concurrent political crisis. The, quote, political crisis, unquote, is the U.S. regime change program designed to subjugate Venezuela. Although sanctions do not seem to be physical warfare weapons, the Lancet, as quoted by Fair, noted, quote, they're just as deadly, if not more so, jeopardizing the health of populations for political ends, is not only illegal, but also barbaric. So U.S. foreign policy is not only illegal, according to international law, but also barbaric. Conclusion. The findings in the congressional report are a recommended counterpoint to those of the corporate media, such as CNN, that anguish over the dire conditions in Venezuela, but obscure the major perpetrator. Ditto for leftish analyses such as Chris Gilbert, who writes, quote, the silent event that shook Venezuela in 2015-2016 involved an abrupt return to capitalist normality. At about that time, the Maduro government decided to step back from interventions in the economy, unquote. Left out of his picture is the fact that U.S. sanctions were imposed on Venezuela at precisely that time. If the U.S. government's propaganda is correct, that the current crisis is due to Maduro's mismanagement and corruption, then legal and inhumane sanctions would not be necessary to dislodge the, quote, regime, unquote. Conversely, Given that the sanctions and accompanying blockade are so overwhelming, the impacts of mismanagement and corruption would be difficult to parse out. In fact, the report says, quote, data suggests that production declines accelerated following sanctions targeting Venezuela's oil sector, unquote. One conclusion for sure is that the U.S. is punishing the Venezuelans for the good things, such as poverty reduction, documented in the report, and not the bad. Otherwise, demonstrable narco states like Colombia and Honduras that are guilty of manifest human rights violations would be treated in a similar way to Venezuela. And Venezuela would be the largest recipient of U.S. aid. The Congressional Research Service report concludes the failure to dislodge Francisco Maduro from power demonstrated the limits of U.S. and other international efforts to prompt, it is actually Nicolas Maduro. I'm confusing him with Francisco Maduro, who is the president of Mexico, following the revolution, of 1910 that replaced Porfirio Diaz as the president, of Mexico. So Francisco Maduro is indelibly in my mind as a result of studying that at some point. But anyway, it's actually Nicolas Maduro from power demonstrated the limits of U.S. and other international efforts to prompt political change in Venezuela. A unilateral U.S. policy such as oil sanctions arguably worsened the humanitarian crisis in the country and caused divisions within the international coalition that once backed Guaido. I pronounced that right? Guaido. There it is. In other words, despite inhumane sanctions by the U.S. and its allies, the Bolivarian Revolution has endured because of its popular support. And that again is by Roger Harris on the board of the Task Force on the Americas, a 32-year-old anti-imperialist human rights organization. So next, also amazingly from Counterpunch, this one on one of our favorite targets, Cuba. This one was on April 27th, 2021. Why the embargo against Cuba? This is by Jacob G. Hornberger. Now the Cuban president, Raul Castro, has resigned the presidency of Cuba. Will the U.S. government lift its 6 decades-long economic embargo against Cuba? Don't count on it. Squeezing the life out of the Cuban people as a way to get regime change has become such a normalized way of life for the United States that it is unlikely that this cruel and brutal policy will be ended anytime soon. Back in the day, the embargo was justified as part of the Cold War against godless communism, quote unquote, and specifically the international communist conspiracy that was supposedly based in Moscow, Russia, that supposedly threatened to envelop the United States and the rest of the world. Yes, that Russia, the one we are being called upon once again to treat as our official enemy. The Pentagon and the CIA steadfastly maintained that the national security of the United States was gravely threatened by a communist outpost only 90 miles away from American shores. But when the Cold War suddenly and unexpectedly came to an end in 1985, the embargo just kept going and going. And even though former communist dictator Fidel Castro is now dead and his brother Raul is now out of the presidency, there is no push within the federal government to finally bring an end to this cruel and brutal program. Why not? Well, people are earning their livings off this cruel and brutal program. That's why not. And they still have the ear of the presidents of the United States who come into office and say, well, what's going on in our foreign policy? What's what? And they give him a country by country summary. And the information he gets is from them. And they have an incentive to keep their institutional integrity, to keep that, because their jobs depend on it. What's up with that? The U.S. government doesn't have an embargo against communist Vietnam, whose northern half killed some 58,000 American men. Why have an embargo against a country that has never attacked the United States or even threatened to do so? I suspect that the reason is that the CIA has never been able to get over the humiliation of having been defeated when its ragtag army of Cuban exiles invaded Cuba in 1961 in a futile attempt to secure regime change on the island. In fact, my hunch is that the CIA and the Pentagon have never been able to get over the fact that their entire regime change operations against Cuba, including sabotage, terrorism, and assassination, as well as the embargo, failed to oust the communist regime and replace it with the U.S.-installed regime that would once again do the bidding of the U.S. government. In the ultimate analysis, it's all about empire and control. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, the U.S. came to the defense of Cuba in its war of independence from the Spanish Empire. Once defeated, however, the U.S. government double-crossed the Cubans and refused to permit them their independence. Instead, the fledgling U.S. empire simply replaced the Spanish Empire. So there, Jose Marti. The U.S. empire then proceeded to control Cuba for the next 60 years through a succession of pro-U.S. dictators who agreed to do the bidding of the U.S. government and, of course, our companies. They were what are sometimes referred to as, quote, puppets, unquote, dancing to the strings of U.S. control. That's, in fact, how the U.S. got its imperial outpost in Cuba's Guantanamo Bay. The U.S. government's puppet regime in Havana gave that portion of Cuba to the United States. One of the U.S. puppets was Fulgencio Batista, a corrupt pro-U.S. tyrant who was ousted by the Cuban Revolution in 1959. I was only 20 then. So, of course, I was celebrating in 1959. One of his programs was to have his government goons go out into the Cuban countryside and kidnap young girls, minors. They would then bring them back to Havana, where they would be handed over to the mafia-controlled casinos, which were giving Batista a cut of the action. The girls would be handed over to the high rollers in the casinos as sexual favors. U.S. officials loved Batista and were hoping that he would remain in power. It was not to be. The person who instigated the revolution was a woman named Celia Sanchez, who had a young girlfriend who was kidnapped by Batista's goons and then raped as a sexual favor in the mafia's casinos. What the Pentagon and the CIA want today is to resume control over Cuba with another pro-U.S. dictator who will do their bidding, just like before the Cuban Revolution. That's what the embargo is all about. That's why they continue to target the Cuban people with death and economic privation. They want to resume control over Cuba, and they want it bad. There's something else to keep in mind about the U.S. government's relationship with Cuba for the last 60 years. It has always been the U.S. government that has been the aggressor. It is the U.S. government that has targeted the Cuban people with death and economic privation with its embargo. It has been the U.S. government that has engaged in sabotage and terrorism against the U.S. people. It is the U.S. government that has repeatedly tried to murder Cuban officials, even in partnership with the mafia, one of the biggest criminal organizations in the world. Finally, I would be remiss if I failed to point out that the U.S. government's embargo against Cuba has always been a direct attack on the natural God-given rights of freedom of travel and economic liberty of the American people. After all, Let's not forget that Americans are the ones who are arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated for traveling to Cuba and spending money there without the official consent of their Washington overlords. If the American people wish to begin restoring a sense of morality to the U.S. government and a small bit of economic freedom to their lives, a good place to begin would be by bringing an end to the 6 decades old embargo against Cuba. It's an evil and destructive Cold War dinosaur that deserves extinction. This article first appeared on Jacob Hornberger's Explore Freedom on the blog. So that was a pretty truthful and pretty terrific, in part, historical post about why the embargo and the sanctions against Cuba are still in place. Next up, the Department of Justice threatened MIT researchers with a subpoena in collaboration with the Bolivian coup regime. This is by Ken Klippenstein and Ryan Grimm. On May 4th, 2021, there's a picture, of Evo Morales attending the 26th anniversary of the founding of the ruling party movement towards socialism, or MAS, in La Paz on March 29th, 2021, after his return to Bolivia. The Justice Department trial attorney repeatedly contacted MIT researchers, asking eventually under threat of subpoena about research they had conducted on the 2019 Bolivian presidential election, according to emails obtained by The Intercept. Sent between October 20, 2020 and January 2021, the emails point to the existence of the Justice Department inquiry and add new evidence to support allegations by Bolivia that the United States was implicated in its 2019 coup. The emails reveal the Justice Department's involvement in the Bolivian coup regime's criminal investigation into alleged voter fraud, which has not previously been reported. The inquiry targeted a pair of respected MIT researchers about their work for the Center for Economic and Policy Research, the CEPR, which is a Washington think tank, by the way, in which they broadly refuted suspicions that Bolivia's Socialist Party had rigged the election of 2019. The short-lived coup regime reached power following a clear script. In the weeks leading up to the Bolivian presidential election in October 2019, the opposition pumped endless propaganda. By the way, this is the script that Trump used here against us in the 2020 election. So listen carefully. The opposition pumped endless propaganda through social media and television networks, warning that incumbent President Evo Morales would exploit widespread fraud to win re-election. The only difference, of course, was that in this case, the incumbent president was the one who spread rumors about widespread fraud on the part of the Democrats and Joe Biden to win the election. Anyway, Evo Morales had become the first indigenous president elected in Bolivia in 2005 at the head of MAS. And by 2019, he was running for his 4th term. He faced intense opposition, often framed in explicitly racist terms, from the Frankenstein coalition of right-wing Bolivians of European descent and supporters of former President Carlos Mesa, once a member of Bolivia's left revolutionary party, who had become hostile to Morales' social democratic government. As the votes were counted on election night, Evo Morales was ahead as expected, The question was whether he would win by enough to avoid a runoff, which in Bolivia is triggered when a candidate wins by a margin of fewer than 10 points. In the official tally, Morales led Mesa by 7.9 points, giving the opposition hope for a second round. But when the official count was released, Evo Morales had won by 10.6 points. There would be no runoff. Without evidence, the opposition immediately leveled fraud charges. It was backed up the next day by the Organization of American States, the powerful hemispheric cooperation organization based in Washington, D.C. Quote, the OAS mission expresses its deep concern and surprise at the drastic and hard-to-explain change in the trend of the preliminary results revealed after the closing of the polls, unquote. Read the OAS's incendiary statement. Protesters took to the street, the military called for Evo Morales to step down, and the opposition installed a new leader, Lenin Moreno, after 3 weeks of unrest. Far to Mesa's right, Añez assumed office and swiftly attempted to eliminate the sense of enfranchisement for indigenous people that the Morales government had brought. While 14 out of 16 members gave Morales' first cabinet were indigenous, Añez did not appoint a single indigenous person to her first cabinet. In the 2 months before assuming office, she had tweeted that Evo Morales was a poor Indian, quote unquote, and implied that indigenous people cannot wear shoes. When she reached the presidency, she declared that, quote, the Bible was returned to the palace. And by the way, that photo was one of President Añez being escorted by members of the Special Force to fight against crime after being arrested in La Paz, Bolivia on March 13th, 2021. How the mighty have fallen. The coup, roughly the same day Donald Trump, by would attempt a year later, was complete. But the U.S. press refused to call it that, instead accepting the allegations of fraud at face value. Quote, the line between coups and revolts can be blurry, even non-existent, unquote, wrote Max Fisher for the New York Times. He cited what political scientist Jay Ulfelder calls, quote, Schrodinger's coup. Those cases which, quote, exist in a perpetual state of ambiguity, simultaneously coup and not coup, unquote, and dismissed the distinction as, quote, old binaries, unquote, now considered, quote, outdated, unquote, by scholars. The Times did not undergo such hand-wringing over allegations that Evo Morales' party had rigged the election. Its October 2019 coverage reproduced the opposition's promises for a, quote, damning, unquote, unreleased OAS report, raising the prospect that a victory by Mr. Morales would be regarded by the international community as illegitimate, unquote. The Trump administration's top diplomat for Latin America, Michael Kozak, condemned the Morales government and vowed that the U.S. will work with the international community to hold accountable anyone who undermines Bolivia's democratic institutions, unquote. But even a surface look at the vote counting process suggested the surge for Morales was utterly predictable. The bulk of the votes that were left to be counted on election night in 2019 had been cast deep in the country's rural areas where indigenous miners, coca growers, and other working class people overwhelmingly favored Evo Morales. The former president hails from the Chapare and was previously the head of the Coca Growers Union. It should have seemed obvious that their votes had put him over the top. Just a year later, in November 2020, late-counted Democratic votes put Joe Biden over Donald Trump in the U.S. presidential election, and Trump called foul. Quote, we were winning everything, and all of a sudden it was just called off, unquote, Trump said on election night. Quote, we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to start. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list, unquote. The U.S. media had no difficulty in explaining why the surge for Biden was legitimate, but when reporting on Bolivia, all of the American election expertise evaporated. The OAS followed its October statement with a more in-depth analysis in November 2019, this time finding perhaps as many as a few hundred cases of apparent vote tampering, but the data in the report did not sufficiently support the organization's allegations of widespread fraud. In a letter to the OAS later that month, Representative Jan Schakowsky, Democrat of Illinois, asked if the organization was, quote, aware that the steady increase in Evo Morales' margin was the result of precincts that were on the average that were more pro-Morales, reporting their results later than precincts that were, on average, less pro-Morales. Why is this apparently obvious conclusion from the publicly available data never mentioned in the EOM, specifically the Election Observation Mission press statements or reports, unquote? And the New York Times did not exercise the same scrutiny. Quote, after the Organization of American States declared on Monday that there was clear manipulation of the voting in October, the paper editorialized, quote, that Mr. Morales was left with no choice but to resign, bitterly tweeting from an unknown location that, quote, the world and patriotic, the Bolivians will repudiate this coup, unquote. In fact, it would be statisticians who repudiated the coup. Researchers at MIT, commissioned by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR, took a closer look at the data and evidence behind the allegations and concluded what many other independent observers had already found. The fraud claims were bogus, according to a statistical analysis conducted by Jack R. Williams and John Curiel of MIT's Election Data and Science Lab. The fallout from the MIT researchers' analysis, which was published by the Washington Post in February 2020, was considerable. In a stunning reversal, the New York Times published an article on the findings, saying that it, quote, cast doubt on Bolivian election fraud, unquote. The prestigious release was a major blow to the coup regime, leading to references in many of the same major media outlets that had peddled the coup government's election fraud narrative. The new insight sapped the coup government's international credibility, which was further degraded as it repeatedly delayed a new election. But with La Paz shut down by protesters, this time the crowds are on the side of MAS. The regime was finally forced to hold an election on October 18, 2020. 3 days before the vote, the researchers received the first of the Justice Department requests. Trial attorney Angela George identified herself as an attorney at the Justice Department's Office of International Affairs of OIA and said that she had, quote, received a formal request from Paraguay, unquote, for assistance in the ongoing criminal investigation. Curiel told her she had the wrong researcher, as he had not worked on any Paraguayan election study. And she told him that actually Bolivia was the one she meant. And so Jack Williams wrote back to Angela George, okay, of CRM. Angela, if that is the entirety of what you need, then yes, that is the final version of the report, the CEPR report. The same version can be found here, published by CEPR, and there's a link to the CEPR report, and that's all that MMT provided. George never provided details about the nature of the criminal investigation, the existence of which had not been previously reported. Attempts to reach the coup government's Minister of Justice, Alvaro Coimbra, were unsuccessful, as he is in prison facing charges of sedition related to the coup. Quote, Yes, because the coup was, after all, sedition. That's what sedition is, isn't it? We have a few questions about the data report, and we would appreciate it if you could let us know when you are available to speak with us via telephone before or by November 6, 2020. George wrote to the researchers when Williams explained his research was based on publicly available information. She replied, quote, threatening, quote, a subpoena being served on you in the lab, unquote, but also dialed down her demands, saying that an interview might not be necessary. Quote, I am simply trying to find out if the report analysis of the Bolivia election that is embedded in the Washington Post article referenced below includes your research and is an authentic copy of the report that was produced and includes the comprehensive research you and Mr. Curiel conducted, unquote, the prosecutor wrote. Threat of subpoena was an extraordinary move, as the Justice Department has strict protocols to protect the freedom of the press and prevent government intimidation. Yeah, like it really follows those protocols all the time, right? According to a source familiar with the investigation, who was not authorized to speak publicly, the Justice Department inquiry frightened election researchers and the academic community and may have had a chilling effect on subsequent research. A former Department of Justice trial attorney who also worked at the OIA told The Intercept that the correspondence was unusual for several reasons. Requesting anonymity to avoid professional reprisal, they said that professional investigators trained in interview techniques usually contact subjects, and there are stiff rules governing any interactions with the media. Quote, generally, OIA would enlist the FBI or other investigative agency to execute an incoming MLA request, such as a voluntary witness interview or inquiry like this one. It's unusual for an OAI attorney to handle it, unquote, the former trial attorney explained. They also said interactions, with the media require authorization from senior Justice Department leadership. So, anyway, it goes on, in this vein. Earlier in 2020, the U.S. government funded media organization, the Spanish language complement of Voice of America, singled out the same two researchers by name, in an article. The story implied they could be taken to court over their study, and, quote, but Bolivia roundly rejected the supposed study from MIT, which assured there had been no electoral fraud in Bolivia. Begins the story dated March 5th, 2020 by Uvinca Gonzalez. Uvinca Gonzalez. I guess, it's Avile, his last name. So, Avile writes that Karen Longaric, then Bolivia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, quote, dismissed the idea of pressing charges against the two who published the article and warned there are harsher sanctions than a judicial investigation, namely to be professionally discredited. So they tried to pressure the researchers some more. Both experts belong to MIT. However, the institution denied any participation or authority, instead document clarifying that both people saw the project through as independent contractors of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. CEPR told The Intercept they had not received any communication from VOZ the America for the article, nor did they hear from the Justice Department about the investigation. MIT's press team did not respond to The Intercept's request for comment. The article echoes a baseless allegation from Lon Garrick that the MIT researchers reporter is linked to people connected to the disputed president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, an ally of former president Evo Morales. Anyway, the article goes on, in that vein. Then starts, leading up to the second election day, the right-wing media ecosystem was once again rife with claims the vote would be rigged, but the effort failed the second time as Mas won in a landslide. Evo Morales, then still in exile, did not run. but his protege, Luis Arce, won 55% of the vote. Once again, there would be no runoff. Áñez had dropped out of contention a month before the new election, leaving Mesa again as the leading opposition candidate. Evo Morales has since returned to Bolivia from exile, and Áñez has been arrested, charged by the new government with terrorism, sedition, and conspiracy. So this was a definite failure of U.S. Foreign policy. They could not sustain the right-wing takeover, in Venezuela. Evo Morales and his party are back, and his protege is in control of the government. So the foreign policy of imperialism failed in that particular sense. And another instance, here is a recent article from the IPS called Democracy and Society. This is from the IPS journal, very respected journal of international affairs. This article is in the Democracy and Society section. It was written by Simone Reperger, or Reperger, I'm not sure. It's probably French, so it's probably Reperger. A ray of hope for Chile's battered democracy. A young female and left-wing assembly will draft a new constitution for neoliberal conservative Chile. This is good news for Chilean democracy. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, Chile is finally embarking on a path towards a new constitution. Last weekend, Chilean voters elected the 155 members of the country's Constituent Assembly, which now carry the hopes of many people and the future of the country on their shoulders. At the same time, the election result presents an earthquake for the country's political elite, because the people gave their trust mainly to young progressive and independent newcomers. Nonpartisan candidates won 103 seats. 78 women are represented. That's out of the 155 members. So that is actually that's a majority, of members. 78 and 77 is 155. And 40% of those elected are younger than 40 years old. In short, the Carta Magna, that is the new constitution, will be written by a new political generation. Many candidates from traditional parties, on the other hand, are left out. The big losers of this historic election are President Sebastián Piñera and his right-wing conservative government alliance, Chile Vamos. Surprisingly, it won only 20% of the vote and thus has no veto power in the convention. But the opposition's center-left parties also didn't do well. The reasons are manifold. They ran with separate electoral lists. They've gambled away the trust of the citizens through corruption, by clientelism, and a lack of willingness for renewal. They do not offer a credible alternative, and they're part of the country's small elite. Only the Young Alliance, Frente Amplio, which first entered the political stage in 2017 and emerged from the strong student movement, was able to achieve good election results. So do we have a new politics for Chile? The election will permanently change Chile's political landscape, according to Reperger. The parties no matter the political camp, now only represent a minority. Only 2% of citizens identify with one of these parties, while 90% believe that no laws are passed in the common interest, but only for the benefit of the economy. These are frightening figures in a representative democracy. In addition to the serious social problems and injustices in Chile, they explain the continuing anger of many people, the violent political unrest since mid 2019, and of course, the current election results. Chileans don't expect solutions from the established parties, but from independent representatives of the people. Some analysts interpret this as a push towards democratization, since the people are now in charge. Others predict the end of representative democracy. What's clear is that the defenders of the status quo are done, and the reform-oriented forces um, represent the majority in the convention. Chances are therefore high that in 2022, a more public welfare-oriented basic law will be ratified that defines new rules of the game between market and state. This would fulfill the central demand of the protest movement. But neoliberalism was born in Chile and must die here too, unquote, was one of the protesters' slogans. Since the dictator Augusto Pinochet established a neoliberal economic system with the help of the pro-market group of economists called the Chicago Boys in the 1970s, the Andean state has been considered one of the most business-friendly countries in the world. As a political legacy, Pinochet left behind a constitution in 1990 in which the role of the state was reduced to a bare minimum. Since then, education, health, pensions have been almost completely privatized. This also applies to essential goods such as the water supply. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the social problems of the South American country in the last 12 months. Unemployment, poverty, and hunger are on the rise. In the capital, Santiago alone, homelessness increased by a whopping 235% in 2020. Therefore, people associate great hopes with the new constitution. They expect a solution to all the pent-up social, political, and economic problems. But a new constitution does not necessarily usher in rapid, far-reaching change, and numerous examples around the world have shown. It will probably take several years before the new constitution actually has an impact on people's everyday lives. The process is important, but it cannot solve Chile's serious challenges today. The suffering middle class needs immediate help. Whether the path towards a more social democratic development model in Chile can succeed depends primarily on four factors. First, the fragmented left-wing forces in the assembly must succeed in forming an alliance across numerous parties and organizational boundaries, across personal disputes and substantive differences. Many members are newcomers and inexperienced in actually negotiating compromises. If they succeed in securing majorities, they will be able to push through their common demands. Second, the country's economic and conservative elite must accept that it is time to give up on their privileges. The richest 10% have benefited greatly from the economic model based on the exploitation of raw materials in recent decades. Even if these forces are now only have a marginal representation in the Constituent Assembly, strong headwinds against any kind of progressive change can be expected from their side. Thirdly, after the initial euphoria, the constitutional process must avoid losing legitimacy all too quickly, must be accepted by the majority of Chileans as an institutional way out of the crisis. Otherwise, the country risks a further polarization and a return to the struggle in the streets. and voter turnout was only 40%, raising doubts over whether a large part of society perceives this as their process. Fourth, there must be sufficient economic and social stability in the next 12 months to draft a constitution and avoid a conservative populist backlash a la Bolsonaro. This cannot be taken for granted in times of pandemic, which, according to the United Nations Economic Commission, threatens to set the country back in its level of development by up to 20 years. If all this succeeds, Chile will become a more social democratic, just, and inclusive country, and the politics of renewal and shift towards a more left-wing, more feminine, more diverse politics would be sustainable. If it does not succeed, the current constitution from the era of dictator Pinochet will remain in place. This scenario holds a lot of explosive potential. However, it is already historic that the democratically elected representatives and not the military are writing the Constitution in Chile for the first time since 1812. Chile is also the first country in the world to have a constituent assembly with equal representation of women and men. This is good news for democracy. So, a pretty significant change in Chile. Whether they can follow through with it and change the nature of the country still remains to be seen. But it's another defeat for U.S. foreign policy that certainly was in back of the right-wing forces in Chile all this time, as it was even as far back as the Pinochet era. We strongly supported Pinochet in Chile. We strongly supported the revolution that was aided and brought about by the Chicago Boys in Chile. We have a terrible record, in Chile. So that's what's been happening, in Latin America. We need to end our imperialist foreign policies all over the world. But first, in Latin America itself, it looks like now that, except for the defeat, in Ecuador, that there's considerable force behind the once again rising pink tide, in Latin America. It has been impossible to overturn, the Venezuelan regime in spite of all the suffering there. What happened, with respect to Bolivia, was absolutely a great thing. Things are looking promising in some other countries in Latin America too. And of course, in Brazil, things are looking far more promising, with Lula on the comeback trail at this point, and with Bolsonaro so unpopular in Brazil, and the total disaster of the pandemic down there increasingly being blamed on Bolsonaro. If Lula is successful in Brazil, the pink tide will really be coming back in force. And by the way, that's likely to heavily influence what happens in Chile also. If Lula brings back social democracy in Brazil, we could see a change, in Chile too. And we could see a big change in U.S. foreign policy throughout the whole, of Latin America. Let us hope for that, because we have caused such evil down there. Such evil. So, I go back to the beginning of your comments now, which everybody greets everybody else. Kay says she thinks she might have seen some of that on Facebook. Yes, the third party candidate panel is what she saw. Bellotta said the Solution Summit was interesting. My favorite panel was Howie Hawkins, Christina Toadman, and her blockchain voting stuff, along with Mark Charles. Well, as I said, I liked that particular panel, but it wasn't my favorite. And KRTD Media says he didn't go live to KRTD. Bashane, okay, I'm sorry about that. I did schedule the live stream to KRTD. In fact, it's right on my StreamYard up here. Facebook is checked off, YouTube is checked off, and KRTD, okay, is checked off also. So can't explain why it didn't work. Okay, I think you have to talk to your technical people. Okay, but it should be easy to get it over there, but it should have been over there now. But Lana says the other good one was Shahed Buttar, Brent Welder, okay, and Dan Whitfield. Okay, I guess I don't agree. I thought that was fairly good, but I thought that it failed to bring out the solutions to getting money out of politics. I was really anxious to see what Shahed had to say about that, because Shahed is a constitutional scholar and Brent Welder, okay, is an attorney. And I was anxious to see what the two of them would come up with when it came to ideas about how to get money out of politics in the face of the Supreme Court. And Lana said, Steph was so strange ducking out like that. Well, I don't know if she was so strange. She was, okay, I think that she explained that she has,
ADHD.
that she's subject, okay, to ADHD. And when things don't happen fast for her, and she's participating, okay, in something, she can't stand waiting for the technical events. So it just, seemed to be, just a psychological problem she had. So, it was one of those things. And Lana says, at KRTD, you might want to instant message or text him. He won't see your note here immediately. Yeah, that's true, but that would not have helped, because as far as I know from StreamYard, I am successfully streaming it, okay, to KRTD. So I think the problem is at his end. If it's failing to stream to KRTD, then there's something wrong with the RTMP link that they gave me, okay? Because I know that I said it right. And I think I have been successful a couple of other times in actually live streaming over there. So it's a technical problem that I'm almost certain is at their end, okay, and not mine. Either they gave me the wrong link, or maybe they've been changing their links with every broadcast. I don't know. I can't say what's going on. But I should have a permanent link to them that I am streaming to. So it seems like it should have gone. Carmen says, I found you in the Biden record. I caught the last bit of the summit. Mentioned the importance of your reading of Dr. Kelton's book that are available for free on your in-depth segments, and a few more things. Thank you, Carmen. Thank you very much. That's very nice. And Lana said, I tried to interject in the chat to read the exceptions clause. Thank you, Lana. That was good. And Carmen Muna says, hi, Mrs. Hulk. Lana said, she was so cute. The girl playing the music and singing. That was very nice. And Carmen said, Debbie Dingell had emergency surgery for a perforated ulcer today. Heaven knows we don't want to lose her. No, we certainly don't want to lose her. Oh, that's awful news. I hope she's okay. I really like Debbie Dingell. So Lana said, I thought Franco was rude to Howie. Well, Franco has his opinions. Rather than consider him as rude to Howie, I want to know more about the basis for his criticism, of Howie Hawkins. But there is a feeling on the progressive left, the more extreme progressive left, that the Green Party has not really been operating in such a way, as to make a revolution here. And that for years and years, the old war horses of the Green Party, including Howie Hawkins, have been rigging their internal procedures in such a way that it's very hard for people who newly arrive to actually influence the Green Party. So in other words, the model that they're thinking of is that all kinds of people had wanted to come into the Green Party and make that third party a success, and that they were not really welcome in the Green Party when they came in. Now, I don't know how true that is. I do know that when we tried to introduce MMT ideas into the Green Party, they were locked down by the AIM forces, I think primarily because people who favored the AIM positive money approach to things had been influential in the Green Party for a very long time, since 2010. And we basically were newcomers that they were just not going to listen to, because we were the newcomers. They weren't going to take at face value what we had to say about the facts of how public finance works in the United States. We tried very hard to try to influence things. In the end, we only got a third of the vote when it came to changing the platform, or maybe it was even only a quarter of the vote. We got the distinct impression, and when I say we, it was actually mostly me, and the Nebraska Green Party, and as well Rodolfo Cortez Barragan. We had a distinct impression they just didn't care to listen to us. Kay says they didn't seem to be positive about the People's Party or the Greens. And Lana said that Dan Lepker made a few good points. Yeah, I thought in some ways that he made the most important point of the day about what has to be done if the left is going to be successful. I explain why I thought that, of course. Lana says Franco was wise to bring up criticism of left media. He was. I said it was all I could do to keep listening to the force the vote crap. Yeah, that's where I thought that Hardlands Media, Paquette Cabello, really went wrong. As they kept saying, I wasn't even sure what he meant when he said that the force the vote was the right thing to do, because force the vote only for a floor vote for Medicare for all was definitely not the right thing to do, as we advocated for. The right thing to do was to force the Speaker vote and to replace Pelosi on January 3rd. Had that happened, we might be in a much different place now. It was a decisive thing to keep Nancy Pelosi in the speakership, and I don't think it was good for the progressive side. Continuous pressure is a very good point. There is too much time, between protests. There is too much time between efforts to influence them. It has to be on a daily basis. There have to be people who arise out of the movement, who have the means. I'm not talking about simply the money, but who have the social media means, the software application means, to be continually beating on these people in the Congress so that we have a presence every single day that they have to contend with. Kay says we need way more progressive media. We need more successful progressive media, more unified progressive media, right? And Barney says, I think if you have an idea, a plan you think might help with things happening in Congress, don't be afraid to voice it, as someone may find out your idea very important for our future. You never know. I think that's true. And I think that if we do come up with some good ideas for these solutions on the summits, we might actually be able to suggest solutions that these people pick up in various areas. I think the solution summits give us an opportunity to contribute that, and it's an opportunity that we should not miss. Carmen Muniz says, I'm so ready to leave fascist book, I even signed up with spacehay.com. By Carmen, but can you get access to Rockfin easily? Okay, I'd like to know about that because I've been considering Rockfin. Kay says, where is Evelina Pond? She might know something about this. I bet she knows an awful lot about it. Carmen says, Kerry got Assange kicked out of the embassy when he went to Ecuador. Lenin Moreno got Assange's citizenship in Ecuador lifted so that he had no further right to stay in the embassy. Though even then, it was against international law for Ecuador to kick Assange out of the embassy because he had been granted asylum, by Ecuador. And Ecuador had an obligation to grant him that asylum. I mean, he was a political refugee. Kay says, why do we have our nose in so many other countries? No, it's not just about oil. It's about all kinds of business. It's about our government in foreign policy representing our businesses, the big businesses, because they have influence over the government and contacts in the government that's continuous. That's every day. Kay says, Cuba has no homeless and has done a great job containing the virus, generally a great job in health. They've sent doctors all over the world to try to help others. And very soon now, sometime this summer, they're going to have a vaccine and they're going to start producing it and shipping it all over the world, especially to Latin America. And it's going to be a vaccine that doesn't cost very much. You can be sure of that. And you can be pretty sure it's going to be a high-quality vaccine, though it probably won't be as effective as the Pfizer, and Moderna vaccines, because they're using, I think, a different technology for their vaccine. They're probably using, the adenovirus but technology for that, which does not produce quite as effective protection. It might get up to 85% or something like that, though, which is very good for actually ending pandemics. It's good enough that with the other things the Cubans do to contain the virus, it will end the pandemic in countries that take the Cuban vaccine. That's very likely to happen. Evelina says, thank you for reading this post on Cuba. It seems the U.S. government is still hell-bent on continuing suffering of the Cuban population. Steve says, I would move to Cuba in a heartbeat for the health care alone if we took the boot off their necks. And Kay says, but me too, Steve. Kay says, went out to look at the thermostat. It was ready to turn on the heat. Shake my head. Turned off the AC and opened the windows. Who's going to take care of things if I ever find a better place to go? I don't know. Evelina says, not much news on Paraguay. Sadly, there is much that is not well there. So I've heard. Kay says, what is going on there, Evelina? Their president, Mr. Amdo, not to be confounded with AMLO, is another right-wing puppet belonging to the... okay, but I heard that he's done one good thing when it comes, to ivermectin there, that it's getting a fair shake there and supposedly having some good results there. Kay says, all these right-wingers need to go everywhere, including here. And Evelyn says, same party which overthrew the former left-wing government. Abdo, in addition, has a special relationship with Bolsonaro. Kay says, we need to get our nose out of other countries and work on fixing our own homeless problems, many other things here in the United States. Evelina points out Henry Kissinger masterminded the coup, in Allende's Chile, and the assassination, of Allende, and says, I believe Nixon was president at the time. Yes, he was president. If I recall, wasn't it in 1973? I seem to recall that was the date, of the coup. Kay says, we're technically a third world country now with all the poverty, homelessness, etc. How can we tell other countries what to do? Well, some third world countries tell other third world countries what to do. That's the way it is. How can we tell other countries what to do? We haven't had justification for telling other countries what to do for a very long time now, but we still have no hesitation in doing it. And Steve Gonzo says, GOP lawmakers aim to slash highway funds by Josh Israel, by Representative Yvette Harrell's proposal would suspend the gasoline tax that funds transportation infrastructure. Eyes roll. And Steve Gonzo leaves a link to that. Steve Gonzo says, miss tonight's politics. #fight night. Can you sum up the summit in 25 words or less? No, I'm sorry. I can't, but you could watch the video after this is over, Steve. It was pretty good, but there were technical difficulties that blew out the first two panels. But the last four panels, were pretty good. Lana says, there are some Green Party purists, and yes, I remember the economic argument, such a shame. Rowan came to Minneapolis a few years back as well to debate the Green Party, Bongiorno, or whatever his name is. Oh, you mean Joe Joe Bongiovanni. Yes, Joseph Bongiovanni. He's kind of sort of a friend of mine in a funny way. And Lana says, they keep saying, quote, all is lost now because the squad didn't play ball. So frustrating. Yeah, it's very frustrating. Okay, there is a problem with the squad, though. And that problem is they're all involved in the internal machinations of the Congress right now. And they're all involved with Jayapal and her planning. And they're failing to communicate what they're doing with the movement that's behind them. So they're losing the loyalty of the movement. Okay, as a result, you have to keep your ties to movements. You have to keep it going. You have to keep the movements mobilized. Because once you demobilize them, they're not going to mobilize for you again. I mean, that was the lesson of the Obama administration. I mean, Obama came in on the wings of masses of people who would have done anything for him, and then he demobilized everybody. And then he got his head handed to him. Of course, we know that he wanted to have his head handed to him in a certain way. But still, the whole thing was so frustrating because he could have blown the political system apart and really changed it had he kept his people active. In the beginning, everybody would have done anything for him. And they did do anything. Specifically, they demobilized for him, which screwed up everything. Evelyn said, too bad Green Party is nowhere open to other progressive political movements. It's kind of funny. In Australia, the Greens have a problem too. I mean, they'd have a problem there, you know, being open to MMT. They may be more open now. I don't know what's happened. But when we first started working to spread MMT there, the Green Party had terrible problems talking to the MMTers. They really did. I mean, Bill couldn't get to first base at all with them. And Lana said, I have the time. I have the heart, but not the time. Yep. Well, people need not only the time, there has to be some money in back of it. In other words, the movements have to raise some money so people can have the time to be active, because it takes some money to be active on a continuous basis each day. But people in general also have to have the means to be active, like for an hour or two a day, and be able to reach people in the government in that hour or two somehow through the software applications. Evelina says they're too wary. Carmen says it would have correction. Lana says, I hope you're going to school them on Article 3, Section 2. Yes, I will. I've already started a little bit of schooling of them, but I didn't have a chance to talk to Andy Kennedy about that. And I had a brief interview with him just yesterday in the run-up to this. And I hinted at this, but I didn't have time during the interview to school him about Article 3, Section 2. And since generally, he never read my stuff, he never encountered that blog, on my website about, how to get money out of politics. Carmen says, I'll check into Rockfin. It's ROKFIN, is how it's spelled. But thanks for the recommendation. Yeah, just check it out. I'm not necessarily saying it's a recommendation. I'm just trying to find out if you can access it easily by phone so that you can see my live streams over there. If I think everybody can see my live streams over there, I mean, I just go. I mean, it's not as if I have a big audience on here. or the possibility, okay, of getting one. Okay, so if everybody who likes my stuff here would be willing to switch over to Rockfin, I'd have no hesitancy about doing that, even right now. Kay says, Hartman has been calling on wealthy members of the Dem Party to do an increase, of the progressive media bit, but none have come forward. Yeah, they're kind of into controlling days, I think. And Evelina says, okay, that Lenin Moreno was promised overt the monetary financing money. He could only get that kind of money as loans. In other words, there was no possibility, okay, of producing that kind of money for them, okay, as grants. He was promised loans, probably from the IMF, not really overt monetary financing. Evelyn says if he turned over Assange, yes, he was promised IMF loans if he turned over Assange. Carmen says the right-wing movement goes hand in hand with neoliberal domination and our corporate enslavement. And Steve says, sum it up, but play on words. Sum it up, pal, play on words, laugh out loud. And Lana says, I agree, the squad is not communicating enough. Well, they're communicating enough in terms of sending us a bunch of emails asking for money. We're getting those all the time. I mean, I get those from Rashida, I get those from Ayana, I get those from Ilhan, I get those from AOC, I get those from Newman, I get those from Jamal Bowman. So, I mean, I'm getting all those emails, but the emails are all one way. In other words, they're not actually engaging as they were when they ran through social media and as they used to engage on Twitter with people who supported them. They're not engaging in an open way. She's not communicating enough, in an open way to her national constituency. I suspect she's still staying in very close touch with her local constituency in New York, that, she's probably out there touchy-feely with them very, very frequently. I think she works hard at that, and that's great. But she's not so much going beyond her constituency now. And if she's going to be a leader of the movement, she needs to do that. Kay says, we need Nina Turner to shake them up. Nina may shake them up, but she might be a disappointment too. I mean, she can really rouse a crowd, but so can AOC, and so can Rashida, and so can Ilhan. I mean, I've heard them all. They're all very good speakers. Okay, and maybe it could be Nina is the best speaker among them, and that will be fine if she's working on a Bernie Sanders national campaign. But if she's, just in the Congress, not much opportunity for rallies there, I'm afraid. Steve Gonzo says, fire Louis DeJoy. You can actually do it now. Yep. I think they will get to that. Evelina says, now Ecuadorians are saddled with a loan to cover the fiscal deficit, that Lenin Moreno left after squandering it. Yes, absolutely. Kay says, need to get Rump's leftovers out of Social Security too. Carmen said, can you comment, on Rockfin? Well, there are a lot of good streamers on there. The Convo Couch is on there. Also, Nico House, is on there. I think the Vanguardians are on there, or shortly will be. Most of the streamers you saw at the U.S. Solutions Summit today, okay, are on Rockfin, okay, as well. The reason why I haven't moved over there is because I have a limited number of platforms that I can stream to without increasing my expenses on StreamYard. Okay, in other words, I have to use StreamYard to simultaneously stream, okay, to a number of places. And I've basically got 3 streams at this point. Now I can expand that to something like, I think it's 8 or 10 simultaneous streams, okay, I forget, but I'll have to double, okay, my monthly expenses. And I'm very hesitant, okay, to do that. On the other hand, if I no longer have to stream to Facebook, okay, and to YouTube, or if I can get rid, okay, of one of them because you would all go over to Rockfin, then I don't think I would hesitate to do that. I mean, I'll give up Facebook very easily from that standpoint because I'm gaining really nothing from Facebook exposure as far as I can tell. And Steve Gonzo said, the OAN, the super pro-Trump news channel, is now attacking Fox News and Newsmax for being a bunch of secret libs, hashtag radical socialists. That's very funny. And Carmen said Nina was kissing Israel's $$ yesterday. And Lana says, I think the Rational National is also on Rockfin. Yeah, the Rational National, I think, is on Rockfin and on, what's that gaming stream? The gamer stream called again. I forget. But I might start streaming over there too because they don't suppress you as far as I understand. Kay says, don't leave me and others on Facebook. Well, that's what I'm worried about, Kay. I mean, I'd like to see if you can easily tie into Rockfin too. If you can tie into Rockfin, okay, and everybody can tie into Rockfin. If my core 12 people can all tie into Rockfin, then I'd probably just, go over there and farm things over there and let that, gradually grow. I mean, I think it would over a period of time, and I would not have to worry about people cutting down on any financial stream I might be successful in, in building up. Okay, so what's keeping me here is you guys. That's what's keeping me here. Okay, I'm here for you. How do we do that? I don't know. Go to rockfin.com and see how you tie in there. I'm not even sure how it works, whether people who are tying in through smartphones can continue to do so. If you can continue to do so and it's easy to do it, then I'd be happy to go over there. Well, thank you, Kay. I love you too, and all of you. Anyway, I think it's time to end this stream. Carmen says, what a dynamo you are, Joe. It's like watching the Energizer Bunny. Great programmers again tonight. Well, thank you, Carmen. I don't normally think of myself as the Energizer Bunny, but there I am. Steve says, I don't mind watching on YouTube since I see notifications on the twit. You mean on Twitter? Yeah. Yeah, but of course, I might eventually be leaving YouTube too, because they've been cutting down on notifications for people like me also. They're hostile to what I do also. Alana says good night, and Dolores says good night. And good night to you folks. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for staying. I'm about to say good night. Good night. And we love UK. Good night, folks.